They told you fear is weakness. That fear is something you must bury, deny, or conquer. But Machiavelli would smirk at that lie. He knew fear was not weakness. It was the ultimate weapon. Not the kind that shouts, but the kind that whispers. You don't see it coming. It doesn't need to break you with violence. Fear simply builds a cage around your thoughts until obedience feels like your only choice. You will not call it fear. You will call it being careful, doing the right thing, not making trouble. But it's fear, hidden in plain sight. You see this in your own life, though you pretend otherwise. You avoid confrontation not because you are kind, but because you fear rejection. You don't speak when you see something wrong because you fear being the one who stands alone. That silence is obedience dressed as politeness. Fear has shaped you into someone who doesn't even notice the bars of the prison anymore. This is how kingdoms, companies, and entire civilizations are run, by quiet obedience born of fear. Machiavelli understood this centuries ago. He observed rulers who tried to be loved and rulers who ruled with fear. And his conclusion was brutal. Love fades, but fear holds. People betray the ones they love when pressure comes, but the ones they fear, they hesitate. They obey. They look for ways to survive, and survival makes loyalty more predictable than any affection ever could. That is why Machiavelli advised, it is safer to be feared than loved. Look around you now. Modern society believes it's free, but the chains are not iron. They are psychological. You work long hours, not always because you want to, but because you fear losing your place. You stay silent in rooms where truth would make you an outcast because fear of exclusion burns hotter than your desire for honesty. The social media outrage, the cancel culture, the fake smiles, they are all masks of fear. You don't even realize how fear governs your every move. Think of history's darkest moments. The crowds who followed Hitler, the Salem villagers who pointed fingers at neighbors, the soldiers who carried out unthinkable orders. Did they all hate? No. Many were simply afraid of standing alone, of what would happen if they didn't obey. And so fear rippled through society like poison, making good people commit terrible acts, or worse, making them do nothing at all. Fear doesn't need to roar. It needs only to suggest that stepping out of line will cost you everything. Your job, your reputation, your life. And that quiet suggestion is enough to turn brave men into shadows. Machiavelli saw fear not just as an emotion, but as architecture, a system that, when built correctly, keeps everyone in their place without constant force. A ruler who masters fear doesn't need to fight every day. He creates conditions where people fight themselves. The truth is, fear works because you want to believe that obeying it will save you. You think compliance keeps you safe. You think staying quiet protects your peace. But Machiavelli would warn you, the more you obey fear, the more it grows. It takes more from you each time. It demands another piece of your voice, another part of your courage, until there is nothing left but a polite shadow that moves when told. You can feel this when you remember the last time you held back. Maybe you didn't speak up at work. Maybe you let someone walk over you. Maybe you stayed silent in a room full of lies. In that moment, fear wasn't just inside you, it was shaping you. Every time you give in, you confirm its power. And in that confirmation, you train yourself to obey without question. Machiavelli would not pity you for this. He would study you. He would point out the exact moments you traded freedom for the illusion of safety. He would remind you that fear doesn't need to scream. It works best when it whispers in your mind. Don't stand out. Don't risk it. Stay small. And you listen because fear doesn't feel like an enemy. It feels like caution, like common sense. But that's how it wins. Fear is not random. It is built into systems of control. Think of courts, armies, corporations, religions, governments. All of them wield fear in subtle ways. The fear of punishment, the fear of failure, the fear of being nobody. Machiavelli would tell you that those who rise to power do not ignore this truth. They use it. They shape the fears of the masses like clay, turning them into weapons that never miss. And if you think you are immune, look closer. Your fears may be softer, but they are chains all the same. Fear of missing out, fear of embarrassment, fear of losing status. You check your phone 100 times a day, not because you love the world's opinions, but because you fear being forgotten by them. You obey trends, politics, even false narratives, because fear of isolation drives you to fit in, to be seen as normal. But fear has another side, a side Machiavelli understood deeply. Fear is also the reason people stay loyal, not because they adore the leader, but because they fear what will happen if they don't. That's why the most effective rulers throughout history were those who created fear without chaos. Too much fear causes rebellion, but the right amount, it creates blind obedience, the kind where people don't even know they're being controlled. This is why you must recognize fear's voice in your own life. You must learn to see when it is guiding your hand, when it is shaping your silence, when it is convincing you that surrender is safety. Machiavelli would not tell you to erase fear. Only fools try that. He would tell you to see it, name it, and use it. The one who understands fear becomes untouchable because they can no longer be manipulated by it. And so, the first step is awareness. Fear is not weakness. It is the silent architect of obedience. And unless you wake up, it will keep designing your life until you are nothing more than a brick in someone else's empire. Fear is not just an emotion, it's a program. It rewires you, shapes your responses, and builds invisible rules you don't even realize you follow. You like to believe that you make rational choices, that your mind is free, but every decision you make carries the fingerprint of fear. Machiavelli knew this truth long before psychology gave it a name. He saw it in the trembling hands of courtiers, in the quiet obedience of citizens who feared displeasing their ruler, in the way entire nations bent at the knee when faced with the threat of punishment. You felt this in your own skin. Think of a moment when you were faced with a choice that felt dangerous, not physically, but socially, emotionally, or professionally. You knew what you wanted to say, but the fear of consequences silenced you. Your heart raced, your thoughts spiraled, and suddenly, survival meant keeping your head down. That is the psychology of submission. It doesn't happen because you are weak. It happens because your brain is wired to keep you alive, not free. When fear enters the system, your mind narrows. Your body floods with stress hormones, your muscles tense, and your judgment clouds. This is the fight or flight mechanism, the oldest code running in your nervous system. It doesn't ask, what's right? It only asks, what will keep me alive? And in many cases, the answer is obey. Don't challenge. Stay quiet. This is why fear is so effective. It bypasses logic and speaks directly to the oldest part of you, the part that values survival above all else. Machiavelli understood this primal wiring. He knew that a ruler who inspires fear doesn't need to argue or persuade. Fear does the work silently. It makes people predictable. It turns their independence into hesitation, their courage into calculation. You stop thinking, what do I want? And start thinking, what will happen to me if I don't comply? Fear narrows your vision until obedience feels like your only path forward. The psychology of submission isn't limited to kings and subjects. You see it in everyday life. A boss raises their voice and suddenly the entire room falls silent. A social group mocks someone's opinion and you swallow your own. A wave of public outrage rises online and you delete the post you believed in just yesterday. The fear of rejection, humiliation, or isolation pushes you to self-censor, to shapeshift into someone acceptable. You call it adapting, but Machiavelli would call it what it truly is, submission. There's a reason why fear can dominate so easily. It doesn't just come from external threats. It grows inside your mind. You rehearse worst-case scenarios long before they happen. You imagine failure, punishment, or ridicule, and that imagination alone is enough to control you. The brain doesn't always distinguish between real and imagined threats. Fear becomes a shadow following you, whispering, "Stay small, don't risk it." And without realizing it, you obey that shadow as if it were law. But the cruel trick of fear is this: it often masks itself as reason. You think you're being careful, responsible, or strategic. In truth, you're being guided by invisible strings. You convince yourself that silence is wisdom, when in reality, it's fear wearing a disguise. This is how entire groups fall into collective obedience. Each individual believes they're just being cautious, while fear slowly erases their ability to stand apart. Think of the soldiers in history who followed orders they didn't believe in. Think of the citizens in oppressive regimes who kept their heads down, telling themselves it wasn't their fight. Many of them weren't cruel or heartless. They were trapped in the psychology of fear. They believed, perhaps rightly, that defiance would destroy them, and so they obeyed, hoping to survive. Machiavelli saw this pattern clearly. He knew that fear, once internalized, doesn't need to be enforced. People will enforce it upon themselves. Even now, in a world far removed from ancient courts or battlefields, fear holds you. It lives in the fear of failure, the fear of poverty, the fear of being irrelevant or disliked. It lives in the subtle glances of judgment, in the raised eyebrows, in the unspoken threat of exclusion. Society doesn't have to threaten you openly. Its silence, its invisible rules are enough. And every time you shrink back, you strengthen those rules. But fear also has a second effect. It doesn't just make you obey, it reshapes your identity. Over time, you stop seeing yourself as someone with agency. You begin to identify as someone who just follows the rules, someone who doesn't want trouble. You stop challenging, you stop questioning, and before long, you don't even remember what freedom of thought feels like. Fear has done its work so well that it no longer needs to push you. You've built your own cage. This is why Machiavelli's insights feel so timeless. He understood that fear is the most efficient tool of power because it requires minimal effort once installed. The ruler doesn't have to be everywhere. Fear lives inside the people, and they govern themselves with it. They avoid risk, they stay predictable, and they keep their heads bowed, all without being told. Fear creates its own order. If you want to break this cycle, the first step is seeing it for what it is. Ask yourself, how many decisions do you make each day that are driven by fear? How many times do you avoid conflict, not because it's wise, but because you fear being disliked? How many times do you silence your own voice, fearing the cost of speaking? These are the moments when fear wins, when fear turns you from a person into a follower. Machiavelli would not tell you to eradicate fear. That's impossible. Fear will always exist. But he would tell you this: fear is only a master if you refuse to see it. Once you recognize it, you can use it. You can feel fear and still act. You can let fear sharpen you rather than enslave you. Because the truth is, those who master fear rather than obey it are the ones who rise. Fear is the sharpest tool in the ruler's arsenal, but it is never used openly. The most effective leaders, both ancient and modern, understand that fear must be subtle, like poison mixed into wine. If it is too obvious, people resist. If it is too mild, they grow careless. But when calibrated perfectly, fear creates something far more potent than loyalty: blind obedience. Machiavelli watched kings, dukes, and warlords operate with ruthless precision. He knew they didn't need to be loved. Love is fickle and demands too much care. What they needed was control, and control is built on fear. But here is the truth. Leaders rarely say, "Obey me or die." They create environments where people assume the consequences of defiance. They let fear grow like ivy, wrapping around every choice, every hesitation, every whisper of doubt. Look at history's architects of fear. Hitler never held a gun to every citizen's head. He didn't have to. The fear of being labeled, the fear of being the next one dragged to the streets, the fear of being different or unpatriotic, that fear was enough to make neighbors betray each other. Stalin ruled the Soviet Union not because every citizen adored him, but because no one wanted to be the first to vanish into the night. Fear made people watch their words, distrust their own families, and quietly self-destruct. And it's not just the past. Modern leaders, CEOs, political figures, even cultural icons, understand how to weaponize fear without appearing tyrannical. They control narratives, plant seeds of doubt, and amplify the fear of loss. Loss of jobs, loss of reputation, loss of belonging. You comply not because you respect them, but because you don't want to be the one left out in the cold. Fear of exclusion has replaced fear of execution, but the obedience it creates is just as powerful. Machiavelli saw fear as a lever, one that doesn't require brute force to move. A single act of punishment, visible to all, is often enough to keep the rest in line. Think of a workplace where one person is humiliated in front of the team. Everyone else falls silent, doesn't they? They know that stepping out of line will bring the same fate. The leader doesn't need to punish everyone. Fear does the work for them. The brilliance of fear lies in how it reshapes perception. When fear is present, people misinterpret everything. A raised eyebrow becomes a warning. A pause in conversation feels like judgment. Suddenly, every interaction is a negotiation with an invisible threat. You censor yourself. You measure every word. You don't even realize how much of yourself you sacrificed just to avoid discomfort. This is the essence of blind obedience, when you give up your will before anyone asks you to. The question is not whether leaders use fear, but how they do it without appearing cruel. Machiavelli warned that a ruler who rules only with fear risks rebellion, but a ruler who blends fear with small doses of reward becomes untouchable. A promise of stability here, a threat of chaos there. It's the push and pull that traps people in the illusion of choice. You obey because you fear losing what little comfort you have. Think of how fear operates in modern media. News outlets, social platforms, politicians, they thrive on keeping you afraid. Afraid of missing out, afraid of losing your status, afraid of the other side. They don't have to tell you what to do outright. They simply keep you in a state of alertness and tension until obedience feels like the only safe path. You repost, you conform, you fall in line, all while believing you're making independent choices. But fear doesn't just control groups, it changes the individual. Once fear takes root, it hijacks your priorities. You stop thinking about growth, freedom, or creativity. Your only concern becomes safety, survival, staying under the radar. Machiavelli knew this. He knew that a fearful population is easier to predict, easier to guide, and easier to manipulate than a free-thinking one. Because fear doesn't just control your actions, it rewires your values. Consider how fear infiltrates everyday leadership. A boss who uses fear to control their employees doesn't need to yell constantly. A few well-placed threats, a sudden firing, a cutting remark, are enough to make the entire office run on silent obedience. Fear doesn't just create compliance, it creates anticipation of punishment, which is far more effective. People don't wait to be told what to do. They police themselves, afraid of crossing invisible lines. And here's the darkest part. Fear spreads faster than reason. You can calm one person with logic, but fear infects entire crowds with a single rumor. Machiavelli knew that leaders who can plant fear at the right moment gain control without lifting a sword. Fear doesn't just make people obedient, it makes them grateful. Grateful for any sign of relief. Grateful for the smallest illusion of safety. And once they are grateful, they will protect the very system that enslaves them. You've seen this in history, and you see it now. Fear is used to divide and conquer. When people fear each other, they stop uniting against the one holding the chains. They fight among themselves, each desperate to avoid being the next target. And in that chaos, power consolidates silently, while you look the other way. Machiavelli didn't invent this idea, he simply dared to say it out loud. He understood that fear, when managed correctly, is more stable than love, more enduring than respect, and far more predictable than hope. And if you don't learn to see this strategy, you will keep falling into its trap. The ones who rule you, whether they're leaders, bosses, or systems, are not always smarter or stronger. They just know your fears better than you do. They know you will trade freedom for safety, truth for comfort, independence for belonging. And as long as fear remains unchallenged, obedience will feel natural, even necessary. Fear promises you safety, but that promise is a lie. This is the cruel paradox Machiavelli understood. Fear convinces you to bow down in exchange for protection. Yet the act of bowing is what weakens you. Fear whispers that compliance will keep you safe, that silence will protect you, that staying in line is the only way to survive. But what it truly does is hollow you out from the inside, stripping away your autonomy until you no longer remember what it means to stand on your own. The illusion of safety is the most seductive form of control. People crave stability more than truth. They will accept restrictions, lies, even oppression if it gives them the feeling that they are secure. Look at any authoritarian regime, past or present. The leaders rarely rule by outright chaos. Instead, they build the illusion that everything is under control. As long as you obey, as long as you follow the rules, keep your head down, and stay quiet, nothing bad will happen, or so you believe. But history shows that fear-fed safety is always temporary. The citizens of ancient Rome believed their emperors would protect them in exchange for loyalty, but that loyalty became a trap. Nero, Caligula, Domitian, each used fear to maintain control, but the people's silence only made the madness stronger. By the time the crowd realized that their compliance was feeding the beast, it was too late. Safety was never real. It was just a mask worn by fear. You see this illusion in modern life too. You believe that obeying every societal expectation will keep you safe. Go to school, get the job, stay quiet, don't cause trouble. But notice how the goalposts keep moving. No matter how much you obey, you're still anxious. You still fear losing what you've built. You still fear falling behind. The safety you think you've earned is nothing but a fragile construct that fear controls. Machiavelli would tell you that fear thrives on this false bargain. It gives you small rewards, comfort, approval, stability, but only if you surrender pieces of yourself. Each time you comply, you trade a little more freedom for an illusion. You convince yourself that silence means security, that compliance means control. But the truth is, every act of blind obedience strengthens the very forces that keep you small. Think of how this plays out in workplaces or relationships. You bite your tongue because you fear losing your job. You suppress your opinions because you fear someone's anger. You tolerate mistreatment because you fear being alone. And with every choice to stay quiet, you build a world where your voice no longer matters. Safety becomes a prison, one that you've built with your own hands. The danger of fear's illusion is that it doesn't just suppress action, it erases ambition. You stop dreaming, not because you don't have desires, but because you fear the cost of failure. Fear makes you shrink your own goals to fit inside its cage. It whispers that trying is dangerous, that staying small is safe. And so you convince yourself that this quiet, predictable life is enough. But deep down, you know that's a lie. Safety has become suffocation. Machiavelli studied rulers who understood this dynamic better than anyone. A ruler who can make his people believe that safety is tied to obedience can control them without constant violence. They don't have to swing the sword every day. The fear of the sword is enough. People will enforce their own chains, convincing themselves that they are free simply because they are not dead. Consider how fear has been weaponized by modern systems. Social media thrives on your fear of being excluded or forgotten. Governments manipulate your fear of the enemy to justify surveillance or war. Corporations play on your fear of poverty, making you overwork for a paycheck that barely sustains you. These forces don't need to hold you by the throat. They just need to convince you that stepping out of line will cost you everything. And so you obey, thinking you're choosing safety when you're really choosing servitude. The illusion of safety is most dangerous when it becomes comfortable. Once you accept fear as a normal part of life, you stop noticing it altogether. You convince yourself that silence is wisdom, that obedience is maturity, that conformity is the price of peace. But this is how empires collapse. This is how free men and women become slaves to systems they don't even see. Fear, Machiavelli would remind you, is not inherently evil. It is a natural instinct, a tool. But when you allow fear to decide your actions, when you mistake its chains for protection, you lose the only thing that truly matters, your ability to choose. The rulers of the past knew this. They created laws and punishments not to protect people, but to keep them predictable. And predictable people are easy to control. You must ask yourself, what has fear already stolen from you? What have you given up for the sake of feeling safe? The job you hate but won't leave. The silence you keep even when you see injustice. The dreams you've buried because failure feels too frightening. Every time you give in, fear grows stronger, and the illusion of safety tightens around you like a rope. But here's the harsh truth. The safety fear promises is not real safety. It is the absence of growth. It is stagnation. It is a world where nothing changes, where you survive but never live. And that, Machiavelli would argue, is a far greater danger than any external threat. To see through fear's illusion is to reclaim power. It means recognizing that safety is not found in obedience, but in courage. It means understanding that fear will always exist, but it doesn't have to own you. Machiavelli believed that those who understand fear, who see it clearly, are no longer its prisoners. They become the ones who move strategically while others freeze. You can feel this truth in your own life. The moments when you dared to act despite fear, those were the moments you truly felt alive. Those were the moments you broke free from the invisible chains. And that is where real safety begins, not in obedience, but in self-mastery. The chains of fear are not broken by defiance alone. They are broken by awareness, strategy, and control. Fear itself is not your enemy. It is a signal, a compass pointing to what matters most, but it becomes a weapon when you let it govern your choices. Machiavelli would tell you, to master fear, you must learn to use it, not deny it. You must turn it into an ally rather than a tyrant. The first step is to see fear for what it truly is. Most people mistake fear for truth. They feel afraid and assume the danger is real, forgetting that fear is often a liar. It whispers worst-case scenarios into your mind, magnifying risks until they seem impossible to face. But fear is not always reality. It's a projection of your survival instinct. If you can separate the story from the fact, you can weaken its hold. Machiavelli understood this deeply. A ruler who knows his own fears becomes dangerous because he cannot be easily manipulated. He doesn't react impulsively to threats because he knows fear's game. He studies it, dissects it, and uses it to guide his moves rather than freeze his hand. This is what you must learn to do. Face fear without bowing to it. Look at it, acknowledge it, and then ask, what is this fear trying to control in me? One powerful method is unpredictability. Fear thrives on patterns, on the expectation that you will react in a certain way when threatened. If you can break that expectation, fear loses its grip. Machiavelli admired leaders who were strategically unpredictable, who never let enemies or allies anticipate their next move. They didn't let fear dictate their decisions. They used fear to keep others guessing, to hold power in the spaces where people expected weakness. You can apply this in your own life. The next time fear tells you to stay silent, consider what would happen if you spoke. The next time fear urges you to remain comfortable, ask what it would mean to take the risk instead. The point is not reckless rebellion, it's controlled defiance. It's learning to act in spite of fear, rather than allowing fear to shrink you into someone unrecognizable. Another key to breaking fear's chains is understanding the psychology of those who use fear against you. Whether it's a manipulative boss, a toxic partner, or a public figure, they rely on your assumption that they hold the power. But fear only works if you believe the consequences are absolute. Machiavelli would tell you, study the fear, trace it back to its source, and see what power truly exists there. Often, you'll find that the power isn't as strong as you imagined. The threat is smaller, weaker, or entirely fabricated. Fear also feeds on isolation. When you face it alone, it grows louder. This is why rulers separate dissenters, why tyrants divide the people. They know that fear weakens unity. To break free, you must connect. Find others who challenge fear's voice, who remind you of your own strength. Machiavelli knew that fear could control individuals, but he also knew that collective courage could topple even the most feared rulers. But here is the hardest truth. Fear will never fully disappear. It will always be part of you, part of life, part of power itself. The question is whether you let it drive you or whether you learn to steer it. Machiavelli admired leaders who could hold fear in one hand and ambition in the other, never letting one crush the other. This balance is rare, but it is the mark of someone who understands true power. To achieve this balance, you must also master the art of presence. Fear lives in the future. It's always about what might happen, what could go wrong. When you anchor yourself in the present, fear loses much of its force. Machiavelli knew that the strongest leaders were those who moved decisively in the moment, rather than being paralyzed by imagined threats. They didn't wait for fear to vanish. They acted with fear still present, using its energy as fuel. The process of breaking fear's chains is not about becoming fearless. Fearlessness is a myth. What you want is fear mastery, the ability to recognize fear, extract its lessons, and move forward anyway. This requires building a kind of inner silence, a mental space where fear can speak but not command. It's the ability to pause when fear surges, to breathe and see clearly, to respond with intent rather than panic. In practical terms, this might look like choosing the conversation you've been avoiding, taking the step you've been afraid to take, calling out the lie when every voice around you is silent. Each act of courage weakens the chains. Each act of defiance reminds fear that it is not your master. Machiavelli would tell you that fear is not just an obstacle, it's a test. It separates those who move strategically from those who remain prisoners. Every person in history who has shaped the world faced fear, but they did not worship it. They listened, They learned, and then they acted with cold precision. This is what you must do if you want to rise above the herd. You will know you are breaking the chains when fear no longer makes your decisions for you, when you can hear fear and still choose to act, when you can feel its weight and still walk forward, and in that moment something shifts. You stop being the subject of fear and begin to wield it as a tool. You create your own presence, your own power, one that others feel but cannot name. Remember this: fear cannot enslave a mind that chooses awareness over instinct. And once you see fear clearly, once you hold it in your hands, it stops being a master and becomes a servant. Machiavelli's final warning is simple, yet terrifying. If you do not master fear, you will serve it. Fear does not need to roar. It only needs to live quietly in the corners of your decisions, shaping your behavior without your awareness. It is not the loud tyrant that destroys you. It is the whisper that convinces you to remain still. It convinces you that staying quiet, obeying, conforming will keep you safe. But this safety is a mirage, and those who live by fear are already defeated. Machiavelli studied power not to glorify cruelty, but to reveal its mechanics. He saw that leaders who rule through fear are not simply strong, they are strategic. They understand human nature. They know that fear binds faster than trust and lasts longer than admiration. And if you are not conscious of this, you will walk through life believing that every action you take is your own choice, when in truth, you are just following orders you can't see. Fear, when left unchecked, becomes your internal dictator. It tells you what to say, how to act, what dreams to chase or abandon. It makes you smaller. It makes you predictable. And predictability, as Machiavelli would say, is the quickest path to powerlessness. A man or woman who cannot rise above fear is nothing but a pawn on someone else's board. But what happens when you turn fear around? What happens when you no longer obey it, but instead wield it? This is where true power begins. A leader who understands fear does not let it paralyze them. They use it as leverage. They recognize that fear can sharpen instincts, heighten focus, and create clarity. When you feel fear, it means something valuable is at stake. The difference between the powerful and the powerless is how they respond to that signal. Consider how fear has shaped history. The leaders who rise above the masses are not those who feel no fear, but those who act in spite of it. Think of Winston Churchill, standing firm while bombs fell over London. Think of the quiet bravery of Bonhoeffer in Nazi Germany, writing truths that could cost him his life. These people were not fearless, they were deliberate. They saw fear and chose to move anyway. That decision is what makes all the difference. Machiavelli's warning is not just about rulers and governments. It's about you. You are either the master of your fear or its servant, and the signs of servitude are everywhere. Hesitation when you need to speak, silence when you need to act, compliance when your instincts scream otherwise. Every time you obey fear without questioning it, you give away a piece of yourself. And over time, those pieces add up to a life unlived. But here's the path out: awareness, strategy, and courage. Awareness means you recognize fear's voice when it speaks. You see how it tries to control you. Strategy means you decide when to listen and when to defy it. Courage means you take action despite the tremor in your chest. It is in these moments, when you do what fear tells you not to, that you reclaim your power. Machiavelli believed that the strongest rulers were those who understood fear's double edge. They inspired just enough fear to maintain order, but they were never slaves to their own fears. This is what you must learn to do for yourself. Hold fear like a weapon, but do not let it weigh you down. Let it sharpen your awareness, but never your chains. In the end, fear will always be there. It is part of what makes you human. But blind obedience is a choice, a habit formed by years of surrender, and like all habits, it can be broken. When you begin to question the illusions fear builds, when you stop mistaking obedience for safety, you take your first step toward freedom. So listen closely to Machiavelli's final words, if he could whisper them into your ear. Fear is not your enemy. It is a test. Pass the test, and fear becomes a tool in your hand, a force you control rather than one that controls you. Fail, and fear becomes your ruler, shaping every move you make while you convince yourself you are safe. The world does not need more people who live on their knees, bowing to invisible threats. It needs people who see through the illusion, who walk forward with eyes open, who understand that true safety comes not from hiding, but from strength. Fear is inevitable. Obedience is optional. And the choice, whether to be a servant or a strategist, is yours. Fear builds invisible walls around your mind, promising safety while quietly stealing your power. Machiavelli understood that fear, not love, is the foundation of control. But fear is not your enemy. It is a signal, a mirror reflecting what you value most. When you learn to see it clearly, to act with precision rather than surrender, fear loses its grip. This script has been a warning and an invitation. Master fear or be mastered by it. If you found this meaningful, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more lessons in strength and clarity.